Welcome to the My Tech Toolbelt podcast. We're your hosts. I'm Shannon.
And I'm Brenda. And this is a podcast where we highlight educators who innovate, engage, and inspire through the use of technology. Thank you so much for joining us today for episode 38 of the My Tech Toolbelt podcast. We are so excited to bring you the third and final part of our assistive technology series. Joining us again is Luis Perez, the Technical Assistance Specialist for the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. Joining Luis today is Kendra Grant, his co-author of the book Dive Into UDL. In this episode, Kendra and Luis share why they wrote the book, how it can be used in the classroom, and why it's so important, not only in the education field, but for everyone. In case you missed the previous parts of the Assistive Technology series, they can be found on episode 31 and 35 on our website, mytechtoolbelt.com. So, without further ado, our interview with Luis Perez and Kendra Grant.
Welcome, everybody, to today's episode of the My Tech Toolbelt podcast. We are so excited to have Kendra Grant and Luis Perez joining us to talk about their book, Dive Into UDL. So welcome. Luis, you're in Chicago, and Kendra, you're in Canada.
I am. I'm in Toronto.
Nice. So you guys are pretty close.
Yeah.
I'm in Chicago right now as we record this podcast, but I'm based out of Tampa, Florida. You know, I'm always just excited to get out and just share my passion and my interest in UDL as far and wide as possible. Kendra, do you want to introduce yourself real quick? I'll let you go first.
Yeah, sure. So I was an educator for 22 years here in Canada, worked K-12 and started working in assistive technology about 97 when Kurzweil first came out. So I started looking at it way back then and have been interested in it ever since. And I started looking at universal design for learning when I was a teacher librarian and read Teaching Every Student in the Digital Age. And that was, for me, was really that pivotal moment of making learning kind of accessible to every learner. And I've since owned my own professional development company out of Portland, Oregon, where we looked at how to use all those tools, including ththose old things called smart boards. They've kind of faded away. And I now work in the corporate environment with adult learners, trying to bring UDL to that environment as well.
And my name is Luis Perez. I'm currently a technical assistance specialist at the National Center on Accessible Educational Materials. That's a project within CAST, which is where that book that Kendra mentioned, Teaching Every Learner in the Digital Age, that was where it was originally published. That's where the Universal Design for Learning principles kind of were created a number of years ago. And so our project focuses on increasing the availability and use of high-quality educational materials. So making sure that things like electronic textbooks and other materials that are used in the classroom are compatible with assistive technology, and that that they work without assistive technology as well, so that they're universally designed. And the way that I know Kendra, the way we got to know each other, was through the ISTE Inclusive Learning Network.
Okay.
Where she is past president and I am the current president. And we've put on a number of playgrounds at the ISTE conference. We co-authored a course on universal design for learning and mobile learning. And then, of course, we're co-authors of this book, Dive Into UDL, which is really a labor of love for the two of us, because it combines so many passions that we have about learning and UDL and technology.
When you went about starting to write this book, who was your target audience that you wrote it for?
Well, before we even get into that, I have a quick story to tell, because this is kind of the genesis of this book, and it explains a lot of why we wanted to write it. Kendra and I were sort of doing a information session for our network, and this educator came up to us, and we were kind of giving them the spiel of, what UDL is, and they said, "I don't have any of those learners." I don't know if you remember that, Kendra.
I do.
It was at the ISTE conference in 2015, and that was kind of a wake-up call to the two of us about some of the misconceptions that people have, and we kind of decided that there was a need for a book that kind of made those connections for educators, especially general educators, as to why they do have those learners. Sometimes they just don't know it, right? The learners may not have a label that's been identified yet. They may not have a diagnosis. But even if they, if they don't, we know that variability is the norm in every classroom. That we're good at some things, we're not. We face challenges in others. So we really felt the need to write a book that kind of would clarify some of those misconceptions and ideas that are still out there, even all these years later, after some of these seminal books have come out. So that was really the start of it. We had done our course together, so we had a good working relationship to build on. But I wanted to throw in that story so people would understand where we were coming from.
And I think for me personally, it was also, like I said, I started in 97 and I thought, within 10 years, this is going to be everywhere, right? Optimist. And back then I did those 30-minute workshops, everything you need to know about. And so I think for us as well, it was like, how do we help people incrementally bring this in rather than that you have to do it all tomorrow? And I think as teachers, we sometimes do that. We want to have it all tomorrow for our kids, but how do we do it in a way that kind of meets our needs and we can do it over time, just like we want for our learners? And that was another big piece of how we built it out and why we built it out that way, to give people who maybe have no knowledge a starting point, or someone who's an expert a starting point.
Yeah, and I think one of the key words that you mentioned in terms of sort of clarifying some of those misconceptions, and possibly why that educator responded in the way that he did, is that a lot of people think, UDL is a special ed thing. Mm-hmm. It's for kids that are in special education. In fact, when you look at the definition of UDL, it comes from the learning sciences. And the idea is the end goal with UDL is to develop expert learners. And not just for kids who are in special education, not just for kids that have a label assigned to them, but for everybody. We live in a world where there's so much information, there's so much coming at us all the time, that some of our students not only have to face that deluge of information, but they also have to probably face the challenge of switching careers multiple times in their life. And so the idea of being constantly, as I'll often get the name Toffler, who's a futurist, said, the illiterate of the 21st century are not those who can't read and write, but those who can't learn, unlearn, and relearn. So the idea of being an expert at learning is the key. And so that's what UDL seeks for everybody, not just for kids who have a label or anything like that. So in terms of, once we decide that that's the goal, right, then we need to accept that idea of variability, and we need to build a flexible curriculum to make sure that we are meeting the needs of a wide spectrum of learners. On both ends, right? So kids who may be in special education, but also kids who are in gifted education, who need challenge as well, and then everybody in between. So we design for the edges, and then we try to cover everybody in between through that flexible design.
That's fantastic. And so one of the things that I hear when we talk about UDL out in the field, and again, I don't go as deep as you guys do. I've definitely been promoting your book everywhere I go. It's hard. It's just a lot of work for teachers to do this. You hear that too, I know, right? Because as we think about meeting the needs of all learners, it's not just one lesson plan. And that's, as educators, that's how we were really, now we're starting to teach them a little differently, where we have different lesson plans, where they have to be thinking about who all their learners are and how many ELL students they have and how many, they got to write all that in on these lesson plans in school. But, that's not really how a lot of teachers were taught. The majority of the teachers probably out in the field today were not taught to really think about meeting the needs of all their learners. They were taught, put a lesson plan together. Hopefully it hits a standard or two, and then we move forward. This book kind of hits on some of those things and has lots of ideas on how you meet their needs and how you go deep and how you, stay shallow, is I think what you call it, right? What would you say to a teacher that says, well, that's just a lot of work? Because I have like 25 kids in my class and they're all different.
25 on a good day.
25 on a good day. I'm talking like most of my teachers have over 30, so I was being nice.
For me, I would say to them that when you start to implement UDL into your classroom, it actually gets easier. And so some of those struggles you have with learners, you get a closer relationship. You understand them better. When their needs are met, that idea of an all-access classroom. It's a great place to start, where you're looking at how can I provide multiple ways for my learners to access this information. You can actually have the learners find those ways as well. And then how can I give them multiple ways to show what they know. So those are those like basic ways of starting to build that in and being intentional in it, not just saying, oh, I think I have it, but really thinking about it and planning it and building that out is a great way to get started. And you'll start to see the learners, if you bring the learners into that conversation as well, you're teaching them about UDL. So again, it just is a really nice way to make that foundation when you're starting out, which isn't super hard, but it does take a little bit of work to find the resources.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and what I would add to that is that UDL is as much about a mindset as it is, just kind of, there is a tool created by CAST that's been revised a number of times called the UDL guidelines. And they're sort of a blueprint that you can use to study the curriculum, but they're not a checklist. They're not prescriptive. Like, you don't take a lesson and you go through each of the guidelines and kind of check them off, because with UDL, we always begin with the goal. So what is the goal, and what kind of goal is it? Is it a content goal or is it a skill goal? If it's a skill goal that we're after, then maybe we can provide some choice in the content that students demonstrate that skill with. And if it's a content goal, then we provide options in the techniques or the tools that they use to demonstrate that skill. So one of the sayings in the UDL field is tight on goals, little means. So kind of starting with a very clear goal and then communicating that to learners. And then, as Kendra said, once you've communicated that clear goal, a lot of times learners themselves will come up with strategies for how to accomplish that goal. And the last thing I would say is that part of creating a UDL environment is that you position yourself, the teacher, as a learner as well. And that's something that we wanted to address in our book, that the teacher is the lead learner who makes their learning visible and is transparent about it. So I'm not always saying I have the answers. Sometimes I need to find the answers somewhere else. And sometimes we know that when it comes to technology, guess what? Sometimes our kids know a little bit more than we do. So if we open things up, actually, we can have our learners do a lot more of the work, as opposed to the traditional classroom where the teacher does all the work and the students just kind of sit there as sort of receptacles of knowledge, if you will.
And you're right. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. I get super excited about so thanks. I went right to the end. But I like, Luis, thanks for kind of coming back to that and that transparent piece that educators are a transparent learner in the process, because I think that's something that's hard for a lot of educators to be vulnerable in their classrooms. And so I like that. And so that's kind of the part one of your book, right? Is working on yourself as an educator and then building your own capacity, filling your own tank. So kicking that off, like, tell me more about, because part one is the professional self. So tell me more about, what do I need to do as an educator to become kind of the best and vulnerable and open to this, and other than mindset at that starting point?
So I think part of it is sort of how you approach it. So at the beginning of the year, you can kind of present UDL as, here's something that we're going to try this year, and together we're going to learn as we go. I'm going to present some things to you, and then together we're going to evaluate, what the results are, and we're going to be co-designers, because UDL is first and foremost, it's about design, right? It's about designing the curriculum intentionally so that it's kind of adaptable and flexible and accommodates variability. But we can't do that if we don't know our learners. So part of I think the best place to start is to have that conversations with learners right up front, and then kind of present it in that way, that this is a new approach that we're going to try, and we're going to learn, and you're going to learn, and I'm going to learn as well. And then the big part of that is, the idea of not just assessment of learning, but assessment as learning. So as we go along, there will be frequent times where we check in with each other. And as Kendra said, we're not only checking in terms of the content, but we're also checking in terms of process and in terms of relationships, because that's kind of what sustains things, is having that relationship with the learner and building that trust and so on. So that's the way that I would say good place to start. And then the other thing to keep in mind is that, like a lot of design approaches, UDL is front loaded. So it may seem like you're doing a lot of work at first, but a lot of that work is with intention, right? And so it pays off a little bit later when you have already addressed a lot of that variability. And so the need to provide individual accommodations may be lessened because you've already accounted for it in the design.
That's fantastic.
Tying into that, I think Louise kind of talked about the classroom really becomes your workshop, really. And what we've traditionally done, we were looking at, when we started writing the book, we were looking at ESD standards. And they talked about agency and empowerment and learner-driven, yet teacher professional development isn't often. Someone tells you where to go. And this idea that you leave, I remember back in the day, we used to all go into a big arena and we'd have it done to us. So if we have it done to us, then we'll probably go back and do the same thing in our classroom. And so how do you make, Louise is describing that, your classroom becomes, your place to experiment. And it's really scary because we're not supposed to make mistakes in those places. But I think the way you're talking about it, Louise, is, opening it up and letting the learners know and actually letting the parents know as well that, learning has changed and here's how I'm going to bring this about. And I think the idea of taking ownership of your professional learning, which is chapter 1, we fought for that. The editors kind of went, well, this is a book about UDL. We need to start with UDL. But really it starts about your mindset and thinking about how you learn and how you want to design your classroom. And that, I think, was a real important piece to have first.
Yeah, communicating that. Like, as you learn new things, make sure that you share that because you're modeling. So a big part of UDL should be modeling. You're modeling for your learners that, you're trying to develop your own learning expertise as well. So that's important for sure. I'll be the first to admit it. It's tough because, for instance, I'm at a conference as we record this podcast. And at these conferences, the expectation is that you stand up in the front and you deliver a presentation. And so that's kind of the way that we replicate, as Kendra said, some of these practices. So every once in a while, it's kind of nice to disrupt the practice. It could be something as easy as at the beginning of the session or at the beginning of the workshop, have people ask them, what is your goal? Like, why are you here? What is your goal? So that at least you put people in the frame of mind of like that idea of thinking about the goal first, and then the technology tools and so on should come second.
The other thing we have in the book under the professional development is also we talk about what's your zone and building out your professional network and your professional learning network. And obviously, all the social media has really supported that and extended that for people. But, that is scary, but I think it really builds out if you can reach out. And that's why in the Inclusive Learning Network, we have so many people who will follow us, get information. They follow Louise. And it's just a great way to get information. There's UDL chats that they can join. So you don't have to be out there putting information out, but you can use it as a place to just kind of join and silently watch and participate that way. But I think that's a really important piece of what we talk about. You can't do it alone, and you certainly should do it in your school. But if you can spread beyond that, it's very powerful. And I think, Louise, we learned that in our course that we designed because we had people from all over kind of coming together. And I think that's where the power came, is when ideas come together through those learning networks.
Yeah, there's a group in Maine right now that's using the book for a book study, which I think is a great idea. So that you're not just kind of going through the book on your own, but you're using it as a tool to study, your practices, to be reflective as an educator. But again, you will learn more as we learn from the course and from the experiences of those who've used the book in that way. You learn a lot more when you do it with somebody else because as educators, it's often a solitary profession. We kind of get our charge, right? We get the standards, and then we go into a classroom and we kind of do our thing. And then very rarely, other than like when they come in and observe you formally, very rarely do we get a chance to kind of step back and meet with somebody else like that and examine our curriculum. And one of the things, jumping ahead to part 2, even like Kendra said, before we even start with the UDL guidelines and the UDL principles, we really wanted to study what are the assumptions about school that we make. So, for instance, we have a chapter where we mention the game of school and how some people get really good at playing the game of school in a way. They know how to, follow through the different steps. But as I saw an article that came out today talking about NCLB and kids who've grown up in the age of NCLB, well, those kids are now in college. And a lot of professors are complaining that, they don't have necessarily the critical thinking skills. So essentially, they became really good at the game of school in K-12 at meeting those expectations that was set forth for them, but not necessarily in a way that made them, prepare them for the future, if you will. So that's one of the assumptions, right, that we started off with. But I like what you said, Kendra, and we included this in the book, how sometimes you look at the top of a river and everything looks calm. But then when you look, if you go underneath, there's a lot of currents underneath. And those are the assumptions. Those are the ones that kind of shape practice over the long run. And so sometimes we need to dig a little bit deeper and really look at some of those assumptions that we make about learning before we could even start putting things into practice.
Exactly. And it's interesting, too, because it's a bit of a stereotype, but sometimes as teachers, we went to school well, right? We played the game, not maybe deliberately, but we probably did well in school, in the environment. And I always say, and usually the people who teach special ed maybe didn't, but being one of them, there's always something that you do. And so I think for me, it's about looking at yourself closely, because even though you play the game well, everyone has a jagged profile, and sharing that. And so really that part 2 is about, it's actually the original title of our book, which was UDL and You, and looking at it for yourself as well and applying those and looking at your jagged profile and sharing it with the learner. And I often talk about, I always had 2 levels of conversation going in my classroom. And one was the learning, and the other was like how I learn and the metacognition and how your executive functions work. And I think for a lot of those learners who struggle, they don't understand that part. It might be just intuitive to the learner who gets it. Their executive functions work. Why wouldn't they? But the other ones feel inadequate. And when you start to talk about them and talk about your own things that you struggle with, I think that really opens up for the learner to better understand themselves as a learner and then start to find ways around it. So, I would say to my students, I will mispronounce words incorrectly unless I hear them. I'm notorious for that. So I use screen reading to hear words so that I can understand, be able to say them. So when you say things like that, it makes you vulnerable, but it also shows the learner that, hey, that the teacher even struggles with things and they're okay.
It's like a normalizing opportunity, right? To kind of normalize.
Well, I would say leveling.
Leveling, yeah.
It's normalizing has some
Sorry. It's almost
difficult implications.
Yeah, but I mean, you're right. Like leveling. It's like leveling. Like everyone has something. Mm-hmm. And it becomes a way of there is no normal. it's just a series of just fluid pieces.
Yeah, and then a lot of it, key assumption too with UDL is that the context plays a role. So we within education, we focus quite a bit on fixing kids because we've come into it with sort of a medical model approach where the kid has something. And we need to find a solution to it, whether it's some sort of medication or some sort of behavioral intervention. So with UDL, we kind of flip that around and we start to look at the environment. So the environment is disabled and disabling at times. It's not to minimize the impact of these things that happen to us, right? That cause pain and so on. But, the environment plays a big role too in how sometimes we can feel disabled. And a lot of it is context dependent. So I may be able to perform a skill in a certain situation, maybe at home when everything is quiet and it's just me. And then when I go in front of a whole room of people, I freeze up because I all of a sudden see this threat. And so just thinking about that, like how different contexts play a role in shaping how we think about ability and disability, that's a big assumption of that part of the book as well. And then once we address those assumptions, then we can start building a curriculum that's flexible and follows those UDL principles.
And then so how do we do that? How do we build that curriculum that follows the UDL principles? I guess that would be is that the next step?
There is a nice tool that I'm going to let Kendra describe because she knows it quite well. It's a UDL lesson planner. But I'll introduce it. One of the things that we did in one of our webinars that we did together is we took a lesson. It was a science lesson that was available, I believe it was on PBS Kids or PBS Learning. And we basically took the lesson apart. So it was like Extreme Makeover, Learning Edition. And we went through the lesson and kind of looked at the different aspects of it, the goals, the materials, the methods, and I'm missing out the assessment. Assessment is a big part of it. And then how do I'm going to make up a word here. How do we UDLize each of those parts of the curriculum? And so that's in the book as well. But then there's also a tool, which is a UDL planner that can kind of help you get started with the next steps. So Kendra, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
We do have, and I don't know if you know that, we do have a companion website. So that is the diveintoudl.com. So that is basically goes through and in a different way the book and gives you some high level activities you can do for each of those. But it basically is, it allows you to take a look at where you are in your understanding of UDL and just choose some strategies and see how they work. But it is that idea of really taking things that resonate. And what's nice is you'll see things that you're already doing. But again, for me, it's the intentionality of that. So it's not like, hey, I already do that, but it's really being intentional and thinking about why or the impact that might have on the learner. So it really gives you that opportunity to go in. And again, it's not intended as a checklist. It's really intended as giving you some strategies, because sometimes it is. It's like that blank piece of paper or a blank screen when you have to write a book to get started. It's going to give you those ideas to get started and to really look at thinking about how will this impact what I'm doing, and what maybe you want to really focus in on, kind of that metacognition of learners. So, you may say, my students, I'd love to jump into the curriculum, but I can't until I have learners who understand themselves. Maybe I need to look at executive functions and metacognition and helping them understand themselves or collaborate and work together before we even get some of these other pieces. So it allows you to really take a look at and customize how you want to approach UDL. And I think we sometimes do get hyper-focused on content and curriculum and materials and those sorts of things, which are important, but also that underlying, what skills could the learner take away if tomorrow there's 400 times more knowledge coming into the world, which there is. What do they need? What am I going to base my learning on? So you can focus in on that rather than perhaps even the content piece.
I'll explain just so that everybody understands how the book is organized, not only in those three sections, right?
Yeah.
At the beginning, we have an assessment that people can take. It's a mini assessment, and it's really to help you sort of pinpoint where you are in terms of your understanding of UDL. And based on that, you'll pick one of three levels that you can follow the book throughout the whole book, according to each of the three levels. So we use the swimming metaphor. So the first level is sort of dip your toes, right? So you've never heard of UDL, or maybe you heard of it a couple of times, but you don't know exactly how to define it or exactly what it is, where it come from. So that's like the first level. The second level is more of a shallow swim. So now you're kind of getting a little bit deeper into it, looking at those assumptions and so on. And then level 3, or the third level, which is more the deep dive, that's where we're really getting at those areas of expert learning that Kendra mentioned. Things like executive functioning, which is, your ability to plan and stay organized and be purposeful, if you will, which is also what we want to do with UDL, be purposeful about the curriculum. And then the metacognition and the reflectiveness, or being reflective about learning. So there's 3 different levels, and depending on where you are, you can go through the book by following throughout the book at each of those levels. And then at the end, there's the application piece, which is where that planner that Kendra's mentioning, everything you need as you read the book and follow along is there, along with some additional resources, right? That, you always have a cutting room floor when you do a book. Sometimes there's resources that didn't make it into the book, but we thought were really helpful and interesting. And so we put those on the diveintoudl.com website.
That the assessment is on there. It's actually, there's a single tab for the assessment, so you can take that as well. One of the other reasons for the website is Louise and I struggled with a print book because it's not accessible to everyone. So we did include things like all of the book images with alt tagging and description for people. So we tried to make our website as accessible as possible and kind of move the book into the digital domain for you. So you're right, and I believe it's in part 3 is where you'll find that link, and it takes you out to just a slideshow in Google, and it does have all of those component parts to it. It looks quite detailed, but again, it's really just a starting point for you to look at any area. For example, it could look at learner variability. You could look at just your instructional methods. You could look at the social environment of your classroom. You could look at deep comprehension or open creation and communication. So we try to pull in some of the ISTE standards there as well, and just what would that look like? And again, each one is at the toe in and the shallow swim and the deep dive. So again, you can decide. You might be in some areas at the shallow level, and at others you might be at the deep dive. So it allows you to get that flexibility yourself to choose where you want to go.
What I love about UDL is that if I'm at the dip my toes in, next year when I teach this, hopefully I don't switch grades or subjects, I can then be at the, I'm waiting now. I'm going to go a little bit deeper, and I can maybe explore some other methods and be able to meet the needs of more students. And then by year 3 or more, I've got this. Like I can really hit hard and try to get a lot of that metacognitive work in there as deep as I can get it. So it's living, right? It's not just like, okay, I got it.
Right, when I'm done.
I've done it. It can always be better, right?
I think another important concept that Kendra and I have talked about too is the idea that at first you may offer some choice, right? You're not going to right away start with a full UDL curriculum, but over time you kind of transfer that responsibility for learning. Mm-hmm. Over time, learners can start to take some of the responsibility of planning, doing some of the planning or co-planning with you and so on. But you can't do that right away because that could result in chaos, and then it could actually set you back.
Right.
But you can do that gradual release of responsibility, and we mentioned that in the book as well, how you move through that from beginning to end.
So do you happen to have any examples of teachers that have used the book and what their reaction is and how they've found the material?
Yeah, like I said, there's a group in Maine, Hillary Goldwaith. She's leading a book study right now as we speak with a group of educators there. And, I haven't heard from them because Kendra and I are actually going to be doing a presentation for them a little bit later in their book study. But so far, I think the reception has been really positive from that book study. And then our ISTE Inclusive Learning Network has done a book study on it, and we'll be doing another one this spring. So we can definitely share with you the link for that once it's up, and you can share with your listeners as well.
You'll also see on our website, we're looking for people to give us examples, and it's always really hard because people don't want to maybe do a little video, but we really would love to have people share those and put them on. So that this is a shout out to anyone who, even if you're at the shallow swim level, so many people are, it would be great to say, here's what I tried and here's my journey. It doesn't have to be long, but we would love that. We have a space in part 3 for that. So definitely, even if it's text or if you do a little mini video, we'd love to have that.
That'd be awesome.
Yeah.
And then, so do you guys have a hashtag or a Twitter?
Yes, they do. I tweeted it this morning. Hashtag
Dive Into UDL. So that was pretty easy to come up with once we had the book title. and just, stay in touch with us. We're both on Twitter. Mine is not my name. So if you search for my name, Luis Perez is John Smith in Latin America. So you won't find me ever. But it's Ion Access, EYEONAXS for access. And Kendra's is a little bit easier because it is part of your name.
That's right. It's my name with F, which is my middle initial in the middle. So Kendra F. Grant. And we actually have had many people reach out to us, mainly through just DM. You can just send us a direct message. And I think that's how we found out about the book study. We've had a couple other people as well. And we're more than willing to do whatever works for you. If you want us to do a chat, if you'd like us to jump on a webinar, whatever we can to help, we'll also do that.
That's awesome. Before we get to kind of where you're going and close us out, any last words on UDL? Why is it so important? Why should we be doing this?
Well, I think it again comes back to what I started with, is preparing kids for the future. They need to be not just expert knowers. Our educational system has tried to do that, right? Make them expert knowers, but you can't be really an expert knower in a climate where information is just coming at you all the time. You need to be an expert learner. That's what's going to prepare you for, making those transitions. And Kendra and I have talked about looking at the next phase of this, which is UDL in the workplace, because that's also a place for learning now. It's informal learning, but it's really important to your performance because the workplace is also changing. UDL is important in K-12. That's where it originated. It's important in higher ed, where it has made lots of inroads. And it's definitely important in the workplace as well. So it's a lifelong thing. Lifelong learning is simplified in UDL. Continue to develop the expert learning skills throughout your life.
Oh, very true. I mean, these students will definitely grow up and move on to careers, so they're going to need those tools, and the employers are going to need the tools.
Absolutely. And being a good citizen, too.
Absolutely.
UDL is about preparing you to be, a critical thinker who, some people may have different ideas about this, but I feel like that's an important component of being a good citizen. And, somebody who looks out for your fellow human beings and tries to solve some of those challenging problems that we face as a society and as humankind. Now I'm going too deep, so you have to stop me.
I know, I was about ready to go on an empathy conversation and be like, empathy, yeah, that's it.
For me, just last word would be, a lot of the UDL for me came from a personal experience with my son, who was special ed and got the label, just try harder if you only focused. And it's interesting because even he's an educator now, but even at the age of 28, you can still see some of the remnants of those messages that he's had to kind of fight against. And I think if you can think about your classroom and really think about not like what's wrong with this child, but what can I do differently so that they can show me what they know and really feel positive about themselves, and not in a fake way, in a real way, that we really value all of those different diversities rather than maybe just those people who are great at print-based instruction. And I think if we can do that, even in small ways, I think that'll really help a whole generation of learners.
Absolutely.
Well, we definitely want to thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your time today. This is
awesome.
So great. I've jotted down 2 pages of notes here just while you guys were talking, so thank you. So I know, Luis, I know you're out and about. Kendra, you're not doing any speaking right now at any big engagements, right?
No, I'll be at ISTE though for sure. So looking forward to that.
Great.
Yeah.
Definitely reaching out.
And we're going to force Luis to write a new book. That'll be the next thing.
Nice.
Stay tuned.
When he's less busy. Because you already have another book as well, right, Luis?
Yes, I do. I do have another book through CAST. It's called Learning on the Go. And it's really focuses more at the application of technology, kind of at that level, with some practical ideas for how to apply technology and creativity in the classroom. But I am out and about. Probably by the time you listen to this recording, I will have done a keynote at the ICE conference, Illinois Computing Educators, not the INS part. But ICE, I'm sure they're going through a rebranding, so it's going to be something different next year. But for now, it's the Illinois Computing Educators. So I'll be doing a keynote there. I'll be doing a session on executive functioning and text to speech. And then one on sort of those creative tools that are mentioned in my book, Learning on the Go. I'll be at the CSUN conference, which is a more focused conference on assistive technology and accessibility. I'll be at the National Educational Equity Summit in April. And then, of course, ISTE. So if you're an educator who's going to be at ISTE, come and look for our playground. Our theme this year is UDL and design thinking. So that's really exciting, looking at the intersections of those two frameworks and looking at the connections between those two. So that's going to be a really, really fun playground. We also do a panel at ISTE. So it's the same theme, but we just bring together a set of educators and kind of have them share their practice with the rest of the audience. And then the playground is more of an opportunity to try out things and do some hands-on activities. So we'll be around. So look for us at any of those conferences. And then, of course, on social media. We're happy to be part of your network.
Excellent.
Awesome.
Just going to say really quickly, Luis, did you ever mention your TED Talk that you did last year at ISTE? I think that if you want to learn more about UDL or you know a lot about UDL, you have to listen to his TED Talk. If you want to cry, it's just a great excuse to watch. But it's a fabulous one that really kind of tells you why UDL is important. And I don't have the exact title, Luis, but definitely something everyone should listen to.
Yeah, they're available on the ISTE YouTube channel. So if you just do a search for my name and ISTE, it's one of the first things that comes up. It's closed captioned, but as Kendra said, it's more of a personal talk. It talks about my experience in education and sort of why I do what I do, why it's important to me. And as Kendra said, I will warn you that you may want to have some tissues nearby.
Yeah, we were there. I think I don't get too emotional, but you got me, Luis, and that's why we found you.
Yeah, that's right.
That's right.
We kind of stalked you at ISTE and was like, we got to meet that guy. that's how we ended up being friends. So,
well, I'm definitely we definitely appreciate the opportunity to just have a conversation with you and with your listeners. And like Kendra said, whatever we can do to further this movement of UDL and inclusive learning, we're happy to help.
That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for your time today. So thank you guys. We're going to share all of the resources that you shared with us with our listeners on our webpage. So it'll be at mytechtoolbelt.com. And we're looking forward to hooking up with you guys either at ISTE or wherever else we can find you.
Yep. Thank you so much, both of you.
Thanks so much.
Thanks.
And
we're out. Thanks for listening to the MyTech Toolbelt podcast. If you have enjoyed listening, please rate us on Apple Podcasts or send us some feedback on our website, mytechtoolbelt.com. We would love to hear from you. This will help us deliver the content that you want to hear. Thanks, and we're out.